We are in Acts chapter 19 in the life of Paul. Paul is in Ephesus and the events that happened in Ephesus, and there's several. One of those things is that he is able to teach in a school of Tyrannus. He's there for 2 years at the school. That's not saying he's 2 years in Ephesus and then he leaves. It's that he is able to do that for 2 years, and it is successful. That Asia learns from what he teaches there. And whoever his students happen to be, they would have gone out and spread it from there to family and other towns perhaps. Anyway, it does say that Asia did learn in these things. And verse 10, and this continued for 2 years, so that all who dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. And he did teach in the synagogue again. That was for really a considerable amount of time before you have those that blaspheme and become enemies of the truth, and they show themselves as such. Last week we discussed that of the unusual miracles that were performed, and that had to do with objects that had been Paul's, handkerchiefs or aprons taken from him, and these could heal the sick remotely. That is, instead of Paul going to some place, some distant farm or distant village or anything like that, these objects can be taken to people in those areas, and they would be healed simply from the contact with, or at least the proximity of those objects that came from Paul. Now we come to this event that occurs. All these things have been happening, and this is now something else is happening, and it really doesn't concern the life of Paul because he wasn't there, but he is being mentioned. I mean, realistically, this has nothing to do with him, but he's being mentioned in it. And this shows that his fame, if we can use that word, is spread out to those that you would think, well, why would they do such a thing? But using Paul is not near as strange as using Jesus of Nazareth, which is precisely what they do. So we go to verse 13. Now, we ended last week on this, but only in a very shallow, which is probably all we can do, shallow sort of way. Then, so verse 13, Acts 19, verse 13, then some of the itinerant Jewish exorcists took it upon themselves to call the name of the Lord Jesus over those who had evil spirits, saying, we exorcise you by the Jesus whom Paul preaches. Now, why are they doing this? Now, we explained last week, itinerant means someone who travels around doing this particular occupation, whatever it is. All right, with this, they are exorcists. What is an exorcist? Well, that's someone who's supposed to be able to cast out demons, unclean spirits, it means the same thing, devils, it means the same thing, from people. Now, understand, anyone pretending they can do that is pretending. Anybody today who says they're doing that are pretending, or they have just deceived themselves. That's it. Whether they think they can do it or not, it doesn't matter. The reality is there are no possessions of people today. That one is not possessed by an evil spirit. One can become evil, and they in fact are the evil spirit. One can go deep into wickedness, and also one can be completely insane. Not to be harsh, but that's the fact. but that doesn't mean that that person has been possessed by an evil spirit. There are physiological or other explanations for it, to where it's not an evil spirit that has possessed them. They may act like the worst sort of behavior imaginable, but it's a matter of insanity, not anything else. Now, in the first century, and I just want to make mention also that Zechariah, who's the prophet Zechariah in the Old Testament, he does prophesy about a time when there would be no more prophets and no more unclean spirits in the land. That there would be a time when there would be no more prophecies, no more, and that there would be no more unclean spirits. That we would not have that as a problem anymore. That prophets aren't the problem, unclean spirits are the problem, that no one would be possessed by them anymore. So here we have some of the itinerant Jewish exorcists were doing this. Okay? Understand, this is a class of occupation. One could choose this as an occupation in that day. It seems like an unusual occupation. Of course it is. But this was a group. You could use the word guildsman to kind of describe this as a set group that has a similar occupation. Or you could call them fellows in that sense of the word, that they share this same kind of occupation. But here is, another word would be co-practitioner, and that this is very much like other trades or other occupations that one could find in the day that maybe aren't found today, maybe not. But it is a real thing, what I'm about to mention, such as matchmakers. Being a matchmaker, and of course if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, you've got the whole song and the whole thing about it. But matchmakers are a real thing, even to this day among some. Okay, even a real thing, very much a real thing. But so were these. That one could, in the first century, come across an itinerant Jewish exorcist. Evidently, they thought they could do something, and evidently others thought they could too. But some of them in this class, and this is what is really strange, some of them in this class would use Jesus and Paul. We exorcise you by the Jesus whom Paul preaches. Now that's very strange to me, because if they truly believed they could do that through Jesus whom Paul preaches, why not follow the preaching of Paul and accept Christ? Why not do that? Because obviously you are admitting there is a power here that Jesus has that Paul happens to be preaching. You have to admit that. And of course they would have known, as anybody else would have, that there are miracles being produced by people like Paul, but not just Paul. That they would be followers of Christ are performing miracles. That would not be a secret. Especially when you have these unusual kind of miracles where a handkerchief taken from Paul or an apron that he gives someone is then taken and the sick are healed by touching it or however it was done. Okay, that they're healed. The news would get around. Now, the question would be, well, if you think that you can cast out demons by mentioning Jesus, whom Paul preaches, maybe, just maybe, you should begin to listen to what Paul is preaching and come to some truth on the matter, because obviously something is being taught, and you want the miraculous side of it, but you don't want where the miracles lead. You want this, but you don't want the behavior. You don't want the obedience. You don't want what may make you a social outcast. Okay? You don't want that, but you want all the benefits. Now, we come to verse 14. Also, there were 7 sons of Sceva, a Jewish chief priest, who did so. So they're not the only ones to do it. And they may not have been the ones who even thought of it originally. But this is just taking them. We don't have every instance in which this was tried, but some were doing it. And now here we have just one example. It's the 7 sons of Sceva, which sounds very impressive. Okay, here we are, a village somewhere in the Roman Empire. Okay, and we have a man who is obviously demon-possessed. He is a problem in town. You talk about, a neighbor who might be a problem, or a man who is like the worst person in town, or the embarrassment of the town drunk, and how incredibly, just embarrassing but also inconvenient such a person could be. But imagine now someone who is the local possessed man. All right, he can't help it, or she can't help it. They can't help that at all. But this would be, in going back to like Mark chapter 1, if you remember there with a possessed man, that he was going to the synagogue, all right? And they're having to deal with him at the synagogue. And what are you going to do with him? You can't do anything with him. You just have to work around him, is what you have to do. And it's Jesus, of course, that casts him out. But this would be one of those things that you just have to deal with. Yeah, that's Mark 1:24. And we'll get to him in just a second. But you have these 7 sons of Sceva. They decide they're going to try this. And so we're this village here, and we have this problem, perpetual problem, so it would seem. And there's no way to explain this man's behavior except he's got a demon. All right? Who are you going to call? Okay, 7 sons of Sceva. All right, that sounds pretty cool. 7 sons of Sceva. Great. Who are they? Itinerant Jewish exorcists. Great. Can we get them? We'll send somebody. We'll send somebody to get them. All right, we need them. And so they are. This is their occupation. And as a village may very well be willing to pool their money together for the services, to have them come. Or it could be a family is willing, if a village is not, a family is willing to get their money together to pay for the services, because who knows how much it costs. All right, you want this demon cast out? Yes, we do, desperately. We want our father back, or we want our son back, or our daughter. We are willing to do whatever. All right. So here they are, and this is one of the things that occurred by those itinerant Jewish exorcists. And so they did so. What did they do? They were confronted. Some man, he's a man, who has an evil spirit. Really, they're not confronting the man, they're confronting the evil spirit. And what do they say? They say these words back in verse 13, "We exorcise you by the Jesus whom Paul preaches." Okay, this is what they say. Now, there's something I do want to, before we get to that, verse 14, there's something in 14 that I wanted to make mention. They are the sons of a Jewish chief priest. Okay, we need to know what that means. All right, a chief priest, and there are scholars who have different thoughts on it. But we do have places like Mark 14:53 where there is a distinction made, and they led Jesus away to the high priests. All right, that's the high priest. And with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. All these are three different categories. So you have high priest, and you also have chief priests. Well, who are the chief priests? Well, in the first century, it may have, and this is a may, and some have better arguments than others, and this is a pretty good one, is that the chief priests were the officers of the temple, that they had specific offices, not that they were necessarily soldiers, but they have offices, such as the treasurer may have been a chief priest, referred to as a chief priest. And you could have the captain of the temple as a chief priest. Overseer of the temple is regarded as a chief priest. Now, there are others who would interpret this or say there's another way of looking at this, that the chief priests actually were those who potentially, because they were in the right family or in the families, that these are priests who could become the next high priest. Now, which one is which, I don't know. And for our purposes, it really doesn't matter. It's just that we can understand that there's a difference between, as far as category is concerned, there's a difference between a priest, a chief priest, and a high priest. Okay, and that chief priests obviously were higher in status than just your basic priest.
Is this the one that went into the Holy of Holies?
No. The high priest would go in the Holy of Holies. Yeah, the high priest would do that. And note from Mark 14 makes a distinction between high priest and chief priest because they are, yes, and with him also were the chief priests. And were assembled all the chief priests. So there is a difference here, and they are sons of a chief priest. Now, they say to this unclean spirit, this demon, we exorcise you by the Jesus who Paul preaches. Now, they get his attention, which I imagine, and you've got to understand some things, all right? Demons and angelic beings are not all the same, all right? You're not the same as me, and you're probably happy about that. And I'm not the same as you, and you're not the same as each other. Everybody has a personality. Everybody has their likes, dislikes, the things that drive them crazy, the things that they love. Everybody has their individuality. Everybody. The same holds true to unclean spirits. Same thing holds true. They too have individuality and personality, and they're just wicked. Okay. They're extremely wicked. And you can tell a difference by certain things that were done by various unclean spirits mentioned in the New Testament. Yes, ma'am.
Do we know where they came from?
Well, we know. You mean originally?
Yeah.
Yes, we can know, or we would just call it best guess. Or I'd go further than that, go to that of necessary inference. All right. Did God create them? Yes or no? Yes. He didn't make them wicked because God created everything good. All right. Did He create you good? Yes, He did. Did He create everybody on earth good? Yes, He did. But I can see a lot of folks that are far from good. Well, who made them that way? Themselves. They did that. Okay? And I think by way of necessary inference, we can understand that demons did not start off that way. And we can also know from the New Testament that their were angels that refused to remain where they were supposed to be, their own domain. They refused to do it. Well, what is that called when you refuse to do the will of God? What is that called? It's called sin, and it's called wickedness. It doesn't matter who you are. Even if you're the Son of God, there in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4, the Son of God fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, you still don't have the right to sin. You still don't have that right. And so where did unclean spirits come from? I think we can come in. There will be those who disagree with me, and fine. You know, do your best in trying to explain it. But this is how I understand it. And I think from logical conclusions that they were obviously created. They did not create themselves. God created them as good, and they went wicked. They just drove off the edge of wickedness. And exactly as Satan. And we know that also another thing that lends to the idea of them being individuals is the fact that they do have names. But this one, we don't know this one's name at all. Okay, so they say, the seven sons of Sceva, they think they can use the name of Jesus and Paul just in case the unclean spirit didn't get who Jesus was. They got whom Paul preaches. So they got to put that little explanation on the end. Well, he knows who Jesus is. Okay, he's about to say that. He knows who Jesus is. And it's kind of absurd that they have to say, oh, and by the way, in case you need to know, it's the one that Paul preaches. Okay, now, somehow they think they can use this as a magic spell. I mean, I have no other way to explain this. We exorcise you by this. We're going to do this by invoking these names. Exorcise you by the Jesus whom Paul preaches. So this is enough to cast out the demon. But it's not enough. It's enough to get his attention, and that's one thing you don't want to do, is to get having no experience in this. Okay, none whatsoever. But in my imagination, well, actually, just from looking at this, and also knowing from that of Legion, all right, you don't want their attention, because who knows what they're going to do. They may ignore you. They may not ignore you. What happened to the possessed girl there in Philippi? All right, she sees Paul and she sees Silas, and she won't leave them alone. She doesn't do anything wicked against them as far as harming them physically, but she won't leave them alone. And you don't like with Legion, wherever you think he is around the graves and all that, and the tombs, you take a circular path around that. You don't travel through that, because if he sees you, what's he going to do? Best you can hope for is that he ignores you, or you can outrun him. That's the best thing. Okay, you don't want, because this is messing with powers, with forces you are powerless against if you are not backed by deity. If you're not backed by God, you have no power against Him. And that's the problem. That's why you would call exorcists, because you can't handle this. And they say they can, so we bring them here. All right, so they got his attention. We exorcise you by Jesus in whom Paul preaches, and the evil spirit and said, Jesus, and this is scary. This is scary in my mind. Jesus I know, and Paul I know, but who are you? All right, to me, that's scary. And let's look at the wording in this, because there is a difference in the wording. He says, they got his attention. All right, and perhaps, not perhaps, it would have been best if they hadn't even attempted this, and it may have been best if they just went in and not said anything like this, but he's going to show them, you don't have the power you think you have. All right, now that might have happened with them ordinarily, but one would think if this happened ordinarily, they would have gone to another career choice. Okay, because we're getting beat up everywhere we go, guys. All right, this is so not worth it. This is so not worth it. You know, being a fisherman, you don't get beat up as a fisherman, and or making tents or being a moneylender. You don't get beat up doing this. But he says, Jesus I know, Paul I know, and those are two different words. The words used in the Greek, translated in English as I know, as I know, are two different words. The first word, Jesus I know, is the Greek word gnosko. It's from that verb. And it means I have a full awareness, I have a knowledge, a good working knowledge on this, and I understand. This person, I know who that is. I know exactly who you're talking about. All right? Now, he says, Paul I know, and that's epistomai. That's a different word. And that means to know someone by reputation, to know someone by way of a third party, like someone says, do you know so-and-so? You know, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. And you would say, well, I know by name. I've heard about them. I've never met them, but I've heard about them. Well, it's the same idea here of Jesus. Yep, Holy One of God. Got him. I know who you're talking about. Paul, yeah, I've heard of him. All right, because believe it or not, the spirits, and this has got to be the case, evil spirits, demons, devils, they've got to communicate. They've got to. You know that they do. They can talk to humans. They can talk to each other. There's got to be a grapevine. There's got to be. Of where, for him to say, yeah, I know about Paul. Well, where will you learn about that? He's got to hear it somehow. Was it from another unclean spirit? I say that's quite likely. One that was cast out? Quite likely he was. He did hear that. Did he hear it by way of some human speaking about it? That's a possibility too. That's a possibility. But the fact of the matter is, he knows that Paul has something these men don't. He knows that Paul has been showing a power that these men cannot show. He knows it. And then he says, but who are you? And implied in that is what do you think you can do to me? I know Jesus can do something to me. I know that. They all know that. As a matter of fact, oh, I did this again. Hang on. I lose my place on this thing. All right, in Mark 1, verse 24. Mark 1, verse 24. This is the possessed man, this unclean spirit, in the synagogue. And he says, he's speaking to Jesus, let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Okay? They know. Every time Christ comes in contact with a person who is possessed, the demon, if that demon can speak, there is the mute spirit, but the demons that can speak, they immediately identify him. And there's got to be something very different about him than the rest of us. And it's got to be something that these unclean spirits can immediately recognize. What are they seeing? I don't know. I don't know what they're seeing. But Jesus had to have looked completely different than the rest of us. He had to have looked completely different. What it was, I cannot answer that. But the rest of it, and one could think of it this way: the rest of us are just unlit candles. You can think of it like this. And here's this one candle that's got a live flame on it. You could think of it like that. Yeah, I recognize that one. These others, I can see this one in the dark. These others, except for this light, I can't even see them. That there is something different about Jesus, and He knows they don't have it. He knows they have nothing. Who do you think you are? I recognize these others, and He doesn't fear them. He doesn't fear them at all, because He's not going to say, have you come to destroy me? Have you come to destroy me? He's not going to say anything like that. He's saying, who do you think you are? And it is explosive violence there. Just completely, asking this question. I know Jesus. I know Paul. Who are you? It's explosive. Then the man in whom the evil spirit was leaped on them. This is immediate response, and it is an aggressive response. And this is you think you can play around with these forces? You can play around with this, and you are powerless to it. You will be a joke if you survive it. You're going to be a joke even if you don't survive it. But you're about to find out what happens when you do something like this, that Christ is not some spell you can cast, nor are His apostles. You can't do this. That there is more to Christ than this. Just, I'm going to use His name and that should do the trick. It doesn't. All right, so He leaped on them, overpowered them, and prevailed against them, so that they fled out of that house naked and wounded. All right, I'm thinking of the words, if you remember with Samson, the words hip and thigh. And he had defeated, I think it was the Philistines, obviously, but he had defeated them hip and thigh. It's like they're broken bones is what they are. Now these men survive and they're able to escape, but I'm just thinking of going away wounded. They managed to get out of there, and he doesn't go chasing them. That was enough to prove his point. Yes, you have 7 against 1. And I think that if you were to look at physically the man who had this unclean spirit, that he would have looked like an average man. I think actually Samson looked like an average man. Certainly one that could be defeated by an army. Okay, but he would have appeared to be. I don't think he would have looked like a massive man, and it would have been obvious. Yeah, you need at least 7 to go after this guy, but. Even then, it's still 7-1, and there is no holding him back. There's no holding him back, and they are powerless against him. They can do absolutely nothing. Verse 17. They're lucky to get out of there, and one would, just in my mind, I'd like to hear their next a group meeting, of we're not doing that again, guys, and start blaming one another. Ed, that was your idea. I didn't. I'd heard that was a good idea. But anyway, this became known, verse 17, this became known both to all Jews and Greeks dwelling in Ephesus, and fear fell on them all, and the name of the Lord was magnified. This had an effect that, they evoked the name Jesus and Paul, yet the Lord Jesus was magnified. I think by common sense, everyone would understand, by common sense, all right, Paul has no problem doing this, and there would be others who have no problem doing this, that if he had been there, this would not have been the result. The result would be that the demon, the unclean spirit, would have been cast away, and the man back to his normal self. And so this became something that was known in Ephesus, and as we made mention, and I want to bring this out again. What has this got to do with the life of Paul? Well, Paul wasn't there, but Paul was mentioned. He's mentioned by these itinerant exorcists, but he's also mentioned by the unclean spirit. He knows him by name. Okay? He knows him at least by reputation. He knows him. So can your name be known not only to God, but others that are beyond our sight? And I have to say, yeah, it could be. Could be. Not that anyone would take that much of an interest necessarily to focus in on you, because of by name, not necessarily, but it is very possible that others besides the Godhead know you by your reputation. It's very possible. Paul did, and now he doesn't recognize them as having any concern. Like you guys are in over your heads, and you can't get out of this mess. It's going to take more than calling a couple of names to do this. Verse 18, and many who had believed came confessing and telling their deeds. Now here comes this extraordinary thing that happens. Verse 19, also many of those who had practiced magic brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted up the value of them, and it totaled 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed. All this is linked together. And I see this as dominoes that are falling. Here you have those that have been practicing magic. What could they know? Obviously, if you have a sickness in a family member, and here's someone over here that practices magic, what are you going to do? We have someone severely ill. We don't know what's wrong with them. It looks like has overtaken them. Come and heal them. All right, that's what you would do. And you wait, and it's not so obvious. And sometimes that person doesn't get any better. Sometimes that person might get better, but in time, or maybe just enough to be psychosomatic to where they think they're better. But that's completely different to what Paul was doing, isn't it? That's completely different from what we see done by way of Christians, that it's not a question of maybe something good happened, maybe in time this will work, but it's immediate, even to the point of where you have the handkerchiefs and aprons from Paul, and they're emitting this power that is from God. These inanimate objects can be brought and do that. And those who practice magic could know what? They can't do that. They would know it. They can't do it. It's like with Moses and Pharaoh bringing out his magicians. Okay? Moses casts down his staff and becomes a serpent. And the magicians, okay, and they do the same thing. Now, I can't answer everything as to how they did it. Personally, I think it was a trick. I don't know. But personally, I think it was. It was a way of fooling Pharaoh and perhaps trying to fool Moses, but you're not going to fool God. All right? Theirs become a serpent too. But what happened to their serpent? All right? It's swallowed up by Moses' serpent. Theirs is swallowed up. All right? Too bad you guys lost your staves or your staves. Too bad you guys lost your serpents rather. But there came a point when the magicians say, okay, we can't do this. This is beyond anything we understand or can mimic. Water to blood, they could mimic that. Then you get to a certain point and they can't mimic it anymore, and they have to say, this is a power that is beyond them.
I think that was when they got to the lice.
Yes, I think it was the lice. Yeah, that was how do you control lice? All right, how do you do that? And so it's one thing. I'm just thinking of modern tricks. It's one thing to be able to control a rabbit or a dove, and kind of put it into a small container, and all of a sudden, it flew out. And it's one thing to do that, but do that with lice, and good luck on it. But I think what has happened, and with the seven sons of Sceva, that they're unsuccessful, but Paul isn't. Paul succeeds, and so do others. The word is getting out that these things are common occurrences now of demons being cast out of people, but it's not by these magicians who have all these books, and it's not by itinerant Jewish exorcists. That's not how it's done. It's by those that they're not just saying the Lord whom Paul preaches. They've got the Holy Spirit backing them. They have Christ backing them because they are following Christ. And now let's look at this and we've run out of time for today. But I just want you to see that they truly have dropped the idea of practicing magic and see it as being nothing, which is going to lead us into what Demetrius is going to be saying, that there is a message here that is changing our world. It's changing our world because it is, you just work at this logically of what they're saying. They are saying that Diana or anything like Diana is worthless, but also, like these in verse 19, that this magic that they had, or any magic, they're working it out logically. Any of this doesn't work. It's useless stuff. And they are willing to burn these books. It totaled 50,000 pieces of silver. That's a lot of silver. That's some costly books that they burned. Now, just by way of principle in this, they could have sold those books and presumably got 50,000 pieces of silver for it. They could have sold those books. Is there a problem with that? You would be helping to promote, if you're a Christian, even if you're not a Christian, but a Christian selling off something like this they would be promoting that stuff. They'd be promoting of where that teaching is now spread. You have something that is in fact being spread out. And they're just going to be rid of it. And they're not going to be held responsible anymore for this idea, and showing that they have in fact given it up. They're tossing all these things into a fire, and they're gone. They're gone. And for a Christian, or as I said, anyone being occupied in the sale of such things, you are in fact selling superstition and darkness and something that is, let's face it, anti-Christ. Because if you can do it this way, you don't need Christ. And obviously, Christ doesn't take us to witchcraft and sorcery, nor does the law of Moses do that. It takes us out of that darkness, out of the superstitious world, and in line with truth and enlightenment. Jesus describes himself as light, and he is light in multiple ways. But we're going to need to finish up this morning. I appreciate everybody being with us. And hopefully and prayerfully, we will continue this. Thank you, everybody.